Hi everyone, and welcome back. I'm so excited to finally have another dyeing tutorial. In this video, we're going to be dyeing speckles. Now speckles, I think that is my favorite technique for creating beautiful hand-dyed yarn. It's a simple technique to do, easy, it's fun. It's super creative, and I know you're going to love doing it. So just follow along, take what you will from my video, but just keep in mind this is not necessarily the right way to dye speckles. It's definitely not the only way. This is my way. It's my method. And as you experiment, and I always say, experiment, you're going to learn from trial and error. You're going to come up with your own techniques and special way to dye speckles. But use my video as a jumping off point if you've never done it before, and just have fun with it. So let's get started.
So again, what I've done is I put a small amount of water in the pan, hot water from the tap, and remember that it's heat and acid. So I've shown in a video how I mix citric acid, so you can refer back to that, but you could use vinegar as well. And I'm going to pour that into the pans as well. I just wanted to show you how much water has been added to the pan. If I press down on the yarn, you can see that the yarn is barely submerged in here. So I really want a shallow level of water. I'm just going to add some acid to this. And then if I need to, I can add a little extra water if I feel there isn't enough, but this is plenty. So that's important to note, because when you're sprinkling the dye, you want the powder, because you want the speckles, you want that dye to strike the yarn very quickly and adhere to it so that you can see those little speckled dots. So I'm going to be using dry powder, of course, and so when I sprinkle it on top, I want the heat from the water and the acid that's in there, I want it to react very quickly. So I'm using a low level of water so that the dye isn't suspended in the water. I want it to hit the fibers directly. And I'm using a high concentration of acid. So I've got 6 skeins of yarn in here. That's about 1.5 pounds of yarn. And for that amount, I'm using about 2 cups of my citric acid mix, or you could use vinegar. So you can play around and figure out what works for you. But I found that that gives me the desired results. There's enough acid in here for that dye powder to strike very quickly. So you can see here on the merino, superwash merino yarn, there isn't a lot of water in here. I've added the acid. So the surface of the yarn isn't submerged, so that's important. It's wet enough so that the dye can react, but it's not, the surface isn't submerged so that the dye will disperse and flow over the yarn, because then that wouldn't give us that speckled look. So it's very important when doing speckling that you keep that in mind. You really want that powder to strike the surface of the yarn because you want a clearly defined speckle.
What this is a proofing, or it's also called a warming oven, a holding oven. So restaurants will use these to rise dough, or they'll use it to keep food warm for the restaurant. So the temperature doesn't get very high on this. I think the maximum I've been able to get this oven to is about 200 degrees. And that is plenty hot enough to set the yarn. That's all you need. What I like about this is that I don't have to worry about damaging the yarn. When I used to use hot plates, it's very hard to control the heat because the pan is directly on a burner. So it was really easy to boil the yarn, and you run the risk of damaging the fibers when it is in such close contact with heat. With this, I don't have to worry about that because there is no direct heat. It just blows hot air and basically the yarn steams. So that's about all the information I have about this oven. It is an investment, and most likely most people are not going to invest in something like this. Because I dye yarn professionally and I dye in such large volumes, this has been a necessity for me. But this is definitely it's not a necessity for most. You can just use your stovetop or hot plates. Those will be just fine if you're looking to dye yarn as a hobby and just for fun.
Okay, so the yarn has been heated through. I'm going to be using loose dye powder to do the speckling technique. So I'm going to be using this loose dye powder. So of course, when you're dealing with the powder, the dye in this form, make sure that you wear a mask. It gets airborne very easily. It's a fine powder and it's not healthy to breathe that in. So I'll be wearing this mask.
I really find that when I'm starting a dye session, it's really helpful to be as organized as possible. I'm not an organized person by nature, but since I've been running my own business, I've had to develop that skill quite quickly, and it's made a huge difference. So I'm going to be speckling with a lot of different colors, so I have them laid out here just to make the process easier. So you can see I'm using loose dye powder, and my preference for speckling the dye is simply using a mesh sieve. I found that to be the easiest way to get the speckle consistency the way that I like it. There's other things that you can use. Some people will just use their fingers. They will just pinch a small amount of dye and sprinkle it on that way. You can just use a spoon. Some even use liquid dye and spatter that using a brush to get a speckle effect. I think I might like to try that sometime, but for now, this has been the easiest thing for me. I just buy these mesh sieves at the dollar store, and they work perfectly. Now, I don't wait for the colors to set between layers. I just speckle immediately. Like if I change a color, I just go right away and sprinkle the next color on top of it. I don't wait for the previous color to set. You can do that if you want. You would probably get an even more clearly defined speckle, but I layer usually so many colors that I just don't have time to wait, and I love the effect that I get. Like, just look at this. Those look like pretty defined speckles to me, and I've probably layered about 6 different colors here, and it doesn't look muddy. It looks great. So the key again is because the dye has been able to hit those fibers directly. I made sure that the yarn wasn't submerged so that the dye didn't dissolve. It just landed and basically set right in place because there was so much acid, the yarn was hot, and yeah, that's the key. So here you can see how those speckles look on mohair. The previous yarn was a superwash merino. It was a smooth yarn. So now on this fuzzy yarn, you can see the difference. You get a little bit, you can see a little bit of the speckles, but for the most part, it kind of, you don't get a clearly defined speckle. It kind of just blooms and kind of forms these big splotches, which look amazing on the mohair. I love that effect.
Okay, so the yarn has had some time to set. The speckles, I put them in the oven, the yarn, and just let the heat do its thing. And now I'm going to test and see if the speckles have set onto the yarn. I'm going to show you what you should be looking for. So I'm just pressing down on the yarn and see how that water is clear. For the most part, that water is nice and clear. You can see underneath, the water is clear. That looks pretty good. So those speckles aren't budging. You can see even when I immerse it in the water, they haven't dissolved, so that means that it's set into the fibers, and that's what we're looking for. So I'm going to flip the yarn and do the same speckling process on the other side. This yarn is hot, so I've just put some gloves on because it was a bit uncomfortable. And I'm just pressing gently down on the yarn so that there's a nice even surface, a nice even flat surface for me to apply the sprinkles because I want it to be distributed quite evenly on the yarn.
I dye speckles on a wide variety of fibers, and I find that as long as it's superwash, it looks the best to my taste. So that's just my preference. The only non-superwash yarn that I will do speckles on is mohair, as you're seeing here. I think the fuzzy texture of the yarn really suits the blurry, hazy way that speckles do come out or tend to come out on non-superwash yarn. I think the mohair has the right texture that suits that, and I love how it looks. Other than that, I don't like dyeing speckles on non-superwash, but experiment and try it out for yourself and see what you like.
So just a quick recap. You want to make sure that your water level in the pan is low with a high concentration of acid. Make sure that the yarn is heated through, that it's hot enough, because what we want is the acid and the heat. We want those to make the dye powder hit the yarn really fast. So when I talked about having a low level of water, we want to make sure that the yarn is moist enough so that the dye can react, but that it's not submerged, because then the dye particles will just disperse, they'll dissolve, and then you won't get that speckled effect. So it's very important to keep those factors in mind to get the desired results. So far I've shown you the speckling technique on bare yarn, but you can layer
speckles on top of color. So I'm going to show you that next. So there's no need for me to really explain what I'm doing here because the steps are pretty much the same. I'm using the same low level of water with a high amount of acid because I'm keeping in mind that I'm going to be putting speckles on top of this liquid dye that I'm putting down. So I've prepared the yarn with the speckling in mind. And I'm just adding these different colors of liquid dye just to form an interesting base to put the speckles on. Experiment. There's different techniques that you could use. You could dye the yarn a solid or a semi-solid before placing speckles on top of it. You could do stripes. You could do some resist techniques that I will be showing in a future video. Lots of things that you can do. And then the icing on the cake will be those speckles. So just enjoy as I speckle away. Okay, so that's it for me today. All the yarn is in the oven. I'm going to let it finish cooking for a few hours
I can leave it in here for quite a while because there's no direct heat, so the fiber's not going to get damaged. But I just want to really make sure that those speckles are baked in and set properly into the yarn. And then I'm going to be washing it, hanging it up to dry, and then I'll be able to show you the finished product, how they turned out.
So let's just take a moment to admire these gorgeous speckles. So what do you think? I think they turned out beautiful, and I like the difference of the two textures of yarn that I dyed these on. You see the smoother texture here, you get that more defined speckle. And then on the mohair, you see not so much speckles, but that hazy, blurry, fuzzy, halo-like texture that I think looks so beautiful as well. And of course, I'm showing some other colors that I didn't demonstrate in the video. So you can just see how much variety and gorgeousness you can get by just varying the colors that you apply. Again, this is where your creativity is going to shine. That really is the hard part, not the actual application or the actual technique. Speckling yarn is very easy, it's very straightforward. The artistry and figuring out your creative voice, that can be where the challenge is, but it's a challenge that I'm sure that you are eager to rise up to, and I know that you will have success. I hope that you find this video informative. Dyeing yarn is such a wonderful creative outlet, and there's so many techniques and methods to learn. So I hope that my little take on dyeing speckles will help you in your own creative endeavors. But of course, experiment, experiment, experiment. I say that all the time. It really is trial and error. It's the best way to learn. But use this video as a jumping off point to give you the confidence to try something new. If you find any methods or have any suggestions or tips that you think will be helpful to others, please leave those in the comments. I love learning, and I'm sure that others would like to keep learning new techniques and methods. That's what I would like my channel to be, a learning platform for everyone. Again, if you're enjoying this content, please leave comments. I love reading the comments. Subscribe if you wish, and hit the bell notification to be notified of any new videos that I put out. And feel free to share these videos to anyone that you think would benefit from them. Again, I want to thank you so much for supporting my channel, and I look forward to sharing many more videos with you. So until next time, bye.